Hey, greetings. Welcome to week 5 lectures. For those of you that were able to be a part of the call last night, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. It was great getting a chance to talk with you. I wish I'd sort of done that on the front end instead of waiting until week 5. But it was great to have that conversation last night. Those who could not be a part of it, we'll get in touch with each other in the next week or so and touch base a little bit and talk through a few things together. So we're going to turn the corner at this point. We've been sort of setting the stage over the course of the last 4 weeks, giving you some background into missional theology, what it means. In the first week, we gave you that introduction. In the second week, we talked about what it means to be the missional church, centripetal versus centrifugal model. Then after that, I laid out sort of the missional schema, the theological foundation, the framework for missional theology. And then in the fourth week, we talked about missional leadership. This week, we've got to talk about what do we do with the holy discontent that begins to bubble up in our hearts. So as we begin to become aware of God's missional call, that we are a church on mission, that God has called us, created us, and dispatched us into the world to make a difference, we begin to realize that many of the churches that we serve and many of the contexts we serve are deeply centripetal, that they have hierarchical leadership structures. All of those things that we've sort of talked about so far, we see evidence of in a lot of the context that we're in. That doesn't mean there's nothing redemptive in them. It doesn't mean there's nothing good in them. It just means that now we have to think in terms of what does it mean to redirect our energies to be what I would consider to be missional change agents within the context of our cultures. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, because change in of itself for a church is a pretty difficult thing. And depending on the level of leadership that you have within a church, that can make it even more difficult, especially, if you're a staff person versus being the lead pastor. How do I influence and affect change when I'm ultimately not the person who is either directing the mission or the vision of the church, or responsible for the whole congregational move? So what does that look like in my life as a staff person, or even as a senior leader? Then how do I shift the congregation that might be deeply rooted in or have bought into a model that is not conducive to a missional theology? So we're going to talk a little bit about change and what that looks like and what it means for us. So generally, when I start talking to churches about change, and moving from sort of that traditional centripetal model to a missional centrifugal model, the question immediately goes to what different activities or what are the behavioral changes that we need to make as a congregation in order to be more missionally engaged. And what I'm afraid of is that when you start with that question, what it does initially is it moves us to behavior modification. That if I can just change certain practices or change certain behaviors, that ultimately that will change us as a congregation. And it could be that those help, but they need to be tied to something deeper and richer. And so what I've given you underneath this particular lecture is a series of drawings that I've been utilizing to help people think through what does it mean to be a congregation and ultimately to re-envision who we are. So you can't start with behaviors and practices, though behaviors and practices are extremely important. There has to be a move within the life of a community of faith in which there's a sense of vision. And by vision, I don't necessarily mean, though I do mean, a specific vision tied to the context and the community that you're a part of. But by vision, what does it mean for us as a church to embrace the missional vision of God within our context? How do we name that? What is that? How do we talk about that within our context? And so it starts with this idea of vision. But vision and DNA are culture, and culture is the sum total of all of the ethos, the feel of who we are, the signs, the symbols, the language, generally the feel of who we are as a congregation. If we have a vision of being a church that engages the broader culture in a missional way for the sake of the kingdom, then what kind of culture, what kind of DNA does that require of us? And it often talks in terms of the kind of people. So let's look at it this way. If vision is what do I hope to see, then your culture or your DNA is who do we hope to be. Okay, and then when you have a vision and a DNA, those should give birth to a set of values, right? What are these operational assumptions that shape explicitly who we are in relationship to our being in this world? And so values like generosity, hospitality, acceptance, a place for the broken. What does that look like? You've got to ask, what are the values that we as a congregation must begin to establish and to embrace in order to see the fruit of missional ministry take place? And so you start with a sense of vision. What does it mean for us to be who we are? What do we see? Then this question of who are we, our culture, our DNA, and then what are the values? What is the necessary operational assumptions that make possible what we see and who we claim to be? Out of that gives birth to certain practices. So the church chooses to do what it does in alignment with its values, which comes from its vision. I hope you can see how all of these work together. So we choose to act certain ways, or we choose to hold certain events, or we choose to engage our community through certain practices based upon the values of who we desire and long to be in relationship to this vision that God has given us to affect change in our broader community. And what we believe is that as the vision and the culture gives birth to values, and those values give birth to practices, that certain what we call legitimating narratives will begin to emerge. And those legitimating narratives are the kind of narratives that validate what you've seen, who you want to be, and what are the operational assumptions that make that possible. So as you begin to live that out, certain stories will pop up. People's lives will be changed. People will begin to testify to the ways in which the kingdom has been witnessed or glimpsed within the context of the broader community that you find yourself. And you as a leader have to curate those stories well. You have to be able to hold those stories up and say, how do we know we're being effective? Because these stories are emerging. Those stories validate and legitimize the vision, the culture, the values, and the practices. And that gives birth to a broader sense of community. You can't hope to change a community just by changing the practices. People hold on to their practices and behaviors very tightly and often don't know why. And so when you go into a church and you're just like, we need to change these practices, you'll get a lot of resistance from people, because people will be like, wait a minute, we've always done this, without ever asking the question, why have we always done these things? And so what you need to do is begin, if you're going to be a missional change agent, you've got to begin to move into the life of the church and help them develop a sense of vision. This is where change really begins to take place, when what they see begins to change, right? So what we see about who we are and our place in this world. So I think it was last night Corey was talking about, a lot of times the people that come in through his ministry see themselves as recipients rather than those who give. So helping them envision, what does it mean for us to be a community that often live in our brokenness, to envision or see ourselves in this world differently, to see our impact in the world differently? Then what kind of culture DNA is that going to require? How is that going to be established in the sense of explicit values that we have? What kind of behavioral practices are going to emerge? Then we begin to curate those stories that begin to legitimize and validate, and that gives birth to a sense of who we are as a community. So I wanted to give you just an outline, a little bit of how vision, culture, values, behaviors, narratives that shape community all work together, and how you've got to help people take and navigate that entire journey through and into missional change. In the second lecture, which we'll do in just a moment, we're gonna explore the power of narrative, or the power of story, and how the power of story begins to shape who we are and how we understand our lives as a community.